Hi, my name is Cassandra Cotton. Thanks for having me here today to discuss the federal government's uh, reducing emissions target announced over the last year. So just a note kind of on the current environment, ag has definitely been at the forefront of many of the discussions around climate change and greenhouse gas reduction opportunities. Much of that discussion is focused on regenerative ag and nature-based solutions, which the government has taken definite interest in, as was kind of seen in their budget announcement, with providing 200 million available for some of those practices, nitrogen management, cover cropping, rotational grazing, which was called for by the Farmers for Climate Solutions. Um, Additional funding, obviously over the last year, has also went to farmers for supports given the year that we've had, especially in Western Canada with the drought, kind of amplifying the need for um, better incentives and programs for farmers to address those issues. Um, this kind of target that the government has announced around the 30% reduction for fertilizer emissions is really captured underneath broader emissions targets that the government has set to 2030 for Canada, and with their net zero 2050 commitments under their Paris Agreement. It is kind of the bigger picture that we're looking at. Not only that, but what's happening across the border from us in the US and how kind of outside jurisdictions are reacting and setting policies certainly has an effect on what we do here in terms of the carbon market and what's happening in the US, and also with carbon border adjustments and carbon border taxes. That's something that's being discussed a lot more, especially with Europe, and also what's happening in other jurisdictions, specifically around the EU and their farm to fork strategy, which does specifically cite a target for a reduction in fertilizer use by 20%. Um, and all of these discussions are happening while we're coming hopefully out of a pandemic, and looking to agriculture to have a place in securing that economic recovery, but not only that, meeting targets from an economic standpoint of 75 billion in agri-food exports by 2025 as well. So the question really is, how do we move forward in meeting commitments for reducing emissions, and ensuring the competitiveness of the Canadian agriculture industry and our place as a supporter in this economic recovery? What we know about the government's target for fertilizer emissions is they've set a target of 30% of reduced emissions by 2030, based off 2020 levels as the baseline. They have stated that it is voluntary and an ambitious target, so not in regulation. However, it is captured as a kind of a sub target under those bigger commitments that the government has made at the UN. I did want to kind of make the point, it is reduced emissions, not use, from fertilizer application. But the government has stated that they intend to pursue an absolute emission reduction target versus looking at intensity-based targets. And so by very definition, from that, it would require a reduction in use to meet those targets. And, we believe as well is out of step with global direction on GHG emission reduction targets. Certainly at the FAO, intensity is something that has been promoted. In terms of collaboration, there has been some informal collaboration. We're waiting for a discussion paper to come out from the federal government any day now, which will give us a bit more information on what their intended approach is to meet this target. but they have said that they would work with the industry to develop an approach. Unfortunately, there was no consultation or collaboration with the ag industry at large, nor provinces in the development of the actual target itself. But we know that it was an iterative process between departments looking at what was potentially achievable. And they have stated a desire to align with outside jurisdictions such as the EU. Now, this was, concerning for our industry, certainly, as I'm sure yours, in terms of very little information and mixed messaging being coming out of the federal government, not knowing what they were looking at doing, and no economic modeling or analysis was done on the target to understand its impacts. Fertilizer Canada did undertake a study with Myers Norris Penny recently, essentially to undertake some of that economic modeling that the government did not do. It was meant to kind of set a baseline understanding of what the impacts of a reduction in fertilizer use as a discussion could mean to Canada, to look at what other jurisdictions were doing, such as the EU, if we were to follow that path. Um, this study focused on corn, canola, and spring wheat. We didn't go outside of um, those commodities, but those make up almost half of, I think, about 45% of seeded acres in 2020. So really looking at the economic impact for those crops from a 20% reduction in fertilizer use. The assumptions are simple and worst case, with looking at it like along with a reduction in fertilizer use for each crop, a straight line reduction in yield was assumed. So, we're not taking into account grower, changing their practices. We're saying for every lost input of nitrogen fertilizer, there's a reduction in yield. And that yield reduction in yield is assumed for each crop based on industry yield response estimates for those crops. This is compared to what we're calling a business as usual scenario, where if things continued on the trends that they're currently at, what the comparison point would be. Although we're not suggesting that business as usual is the way to go either. Again, this was a need to engage with the feds on economic impacts of non-science-based policy directives, which we believe this was, and really wanting to get the conversation on what are the perhaps unintended impacts of setting these kinds of policies without having any modeling done. The impact is large when we're looking at it with those assumptions. And essentially that is due to the lost yields that would occur due to a straight reduction in fertilizer use with no other practices being implemented. I think one of the things that we find frustrating is that Canadian farmers are, on the whole, not over applying nitrogen fertilizer. We use nitrogen very efficiently compared to our competitors in places like Europe, in countries where over application is the case or the norm. Reducing rates may not impact yield in the same way, but we are not one of those countries. Our NUE is in the range of about 70%. I think it goes from 66 to 78, depending on what you're incorporating there, like legumes and otherwise. But we're also accomplishing this while increasing productivity as a net positive contributor to global food security. So if it's not grown here, it will be grown somewhere else. And what does that mean for carbon leakage? And what are the climate change policy impacts for countries that are not exporters of food like we are, like Europe, that look to feed themselves and not the world like we do. The other impact that this is bound to have is really on the crushing capacity and export capacity for canola. We've had a lot of recent investment announcement in the crushing industry, we want to ensure that that remains in Canada, remains competitive. In terms of our kind of desired outcomes for this target, we would really like to see the discussion pivot towards emission intensity targets, considering the emissions per unit of crop being produced so that we're able to maintain our export market. Any mechanisms that the government is looking to achieve with the target, we're asking that they remain voluntary, they incentivize farmers, and integrate the forest nutrient stewardship program when we're discussing nitrogen management components as the recommended approach, provides growers with continued flexibility on the field. We know that nitrogen management is very site specific, and it's a dangerous conversation to get into, having the need to reduce fertilizer use across the board, across the country, as a blanket statement. Rather, we need to be discussing the need to optimize nitrogen use. Those are two very different discussions. The certified crop advisor community in Canada is a very extensive network that exists that work very closely with growers as their trusted advisors. There's opportunities to expand on that network, expand on training, and provide the proper supports to them to implement the 4Rs and other things that we know reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Any spending programs announced at the government, like the recently announced $200 million under the budget, although I suspect there will be further budget announcements. Excuse me. We want to make sure that those spending programs do not undermine any potential for private sector or government regulated offset systems down the road. Rather, we would be able to spend in areas that would build capacity for farmers to be able to participate in those programs down the road. So ensuring that they're incentivized to make those step changes towards that. And then finally, just not punishing early adopters to this. If we're making efforts towards 2030 and ultimately 2050, we need to ensure that growers are rewarded for that. That additionality does not become an issue, and that we're able to get recognition for those farmers. So as I said, there is an option to rate, an alternate option to rate only based discussions, looking at things a little bit more holistically, providing growers with flexibility, and that's for nutrient stewardship. We have been working with growers across the country and industry to develop the program over the last decade and a half. It's based in science. It has the acceptance of the provinces and the ag industry. It provides growers with flexibility to make decisions that's right for their farm and allows them to remain competitive. It does look at rate, but it looks at other opportunities to improve and optimize their nitrogen use. We've been working, like I said, across the country on this program. We do collect acres under 4R. As of last year, 2019, we had 4 million acres. We're currently looking at the last growing season, and I think we're on track at this point to hit almost 7 million acres under 4Rs. That's agronomy programming that's run by the CCA community and agri-retail community, and is placed on their hands to report in acres versus at the growers' feet, which we know is very difficult for growers to do. We have target commitments both from different grower organizations such as Canola, as well as the forests have been integrated into different provincial environmental plans. And we do have provincial agreements in place with many of those major crop producing provinces on the value of the 4 Rs. Not to mention again that it's really grounded in science, and there's scientists across really North America and globally working on the research to advance those practices and get a better understanding of the potential. When we're speaking about N2O emissions specifically and looking to really move the needle on practices with nitrogen application, there is a subset of practices under the broader foundation of the 4Rs that address N2O by up to 35% at the high end and 15% at a basic level. And this is really under the 4R Climate Smart Protocol, something that we've been asking for the government to prioritize within ECCC. And those practices really include things like you're utilizing a nitrification inhibitor, banding your nitrogen versus broadcasting it, you're utilizing variable rate in terms of your application, and you have a qualified agronomist is signing off on those recommendations with an actual plan. We know that a lot of these benefits are much more positive on the environmental benefit than the agronomic benefit. Certainly in the case of a nitrification inhibitor, we know that between 20 to 40% less N2O emissions occur, which is substantial. There's an 8 to 15% NUE gain, but the yield gain is less in terms of anywhere from 1 to 10% in yield gain. So these are more expensive as well. So we need to have incentives in place for growers to take on those kinds of practices. We know that about almost 25% of growers across Canada are incorporating enhanced efficiency products in their farms. So, we have a starting point in terms of actual adoption of the protocol practices or those more advanced practices. 5% or under across Canada are implementing practices consistent with this on a whole. So we have a starting point. We're not starting at ground zero on this, but there's room for advancement and improvement. We are really pushing with the government to recognize the protocol and the 4Rs and the opportunity there, which, as I said, can reduce emissions by up to 35%. Across Canada, those are big emissions that can happen, but it's practice change and that takes time. Growers are engaging in a lot of risk on their farm year over year to change practices. They need to see the economic benefit in addition to the environmental benefit year over year. So it will take time to implement. So what needs to happen to ensure kind of industry remains competitive as we go into this discussion around greenhouse gas emissions and targets is really focused on 4 components for us. One, focusing on emissions intensity and delivering outcomes that are both beneficial for the environment and for farmers. The need to recognize for nutrient stewardship as an opportunity to be a win-win solution to what the government is trying to accomplish. Specifically prioritizing the 4R Climate Smart Protocol to provide growers with an opportunity to be rewarded substantially for those emissions that are being reduced. And finally, something we didn't discuss here, but is probably a discussion all in itself, is really around the National Inventory Report. If final success will be measured with the National Inventory Report towards this, which is how Canada reports on all of its emissions internationally, the current formula for fertilizer emissions is simplistic, doesn't take into account any of those sustainable practices under the 4Rs that we know are being used. And so how can we be successful when nothing that achieves success is being measured? We need to look at integrating N2O reduction again with soil organic carbon increase. A lot of the practices that we're looking at are around how can we increase our soil organic carbon. That is the end goal, but soil organic carbon is not accounted for under agriculture in the National Inventory Report. So if that is a measure, agriculture needs to be credited with that. So that's it for me. Happy to take any questions or further to the discussion. Thank you for your time.